I'm Simon Pentol. I'm a barrister of many years standing now, and I'm a board member of the British Association for Sport and Law, and for the last 10 or so years my practice has moved on from specialising in heavy-duty criminal work, leading in a large number of cases of fraud and serious crime, to specialising in sports work. I think it's fair to say that most lawyers involved in sport, in general terms, are involved in it because they have a real passion and love for sport. And I'm no different. My great passion is football, to a lesser extent boxing and other sports, but predominantly football. I'm a football nut, and I think most people are, and certainly within the law. And I was very lucky to have established a practice for some many years now, representing what are otherwise called high-profile clients in music work, and through them ultimately in sports work. And if I was to have a big break, it probably was about a dozen years or so ago when I led for the main defendant in a nightclub incident involving John Terry and Jody Morris, who were then both at Chelsea. And as a result of that case, and spending a lot of time with the players, particularly John Terry, with whom I forged a very good relationship, the suggestion was that I could perhaps assist them in their disciplinary and regulatory type matters, and also to advise them ultimately on other legal issues. I was only too happy to grasp that particular nettle for obvious reasons, and I was also fortunate that at the time, those at Chelsea in positions of power were very pleased with what I did, although I didn't represent John at trial, but I represented the first defendant, who was the then Wimbledon left back, Des Byrne. I had to do a lot of the work that ultimately led to John Terry's acquittal in order to get my own client acquitted. And as a result of that, I forged a good relationship with Chelsea and the people involved there, particularly Gwyn Williams, who's now at Leeds United, and thus the ball got rolling. So that was all happening for me on the one hand, and the parallel to that, and very important to where I am now, is that I've been fortunate enough for many years now to have been instructed by Mel Goldberg, the doyen of sports solicitors, and of course the current president of the British Association for Sport and Law. I can't understand why Mel ever took to me, but he did. And I was therefore fortunate enough to be instructed in many cases, sports-based, in which he was involved, on all number of matters, advising generally, assisting his clients, representing them in disciplinary and regulatory issues, and taking matters on thereafter. And thus it has snowballed to the extent now that a huge part of my practice is, in the widest sense, involved in sports representation of particularly footballers, of clubs, of federations, and also very much in boxing, equally for fighters as opposed to promoters or managers, and assisting them in the ongoing battles they have with regard to their management in the widest sense, because of the ways in which boxing works, and of course the particular structure in order to either get out of very unfair contracts that they've agreed with their promoters or managers, and in certain cases for particular offences inside the ring. And I've represented a couple of very high-profile British fighters who have done what perhaps they shouldn't have in the course of a boxing fight and have had to suffer the consequences, but appearing before the British Boxing Board of Control, Southern Area, or ultimately before the stewards, is the same process in real terms, or very similar process in real terms, as it is appearing before the FA for a player, and ultimately a very similar process to appearing back in the day at the Magistrates' Court, at the lowest level or at the highest level, before, for example, the Court of Appeal Criminal Division. And as I've often put it, if you can deal with the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, then no chairman of any board, regulatory or discipline for any sport in this country, or any chairman of a football club or any high-powered person in sport holds any fear for you once you've had to go toe-to-toe and slug it out with some of the greatest legal minds in the country for a client who is seeking to have their conviction overturned. Well, I've been fortunate in many respects, not just in the way in which my practice has developed, but in representing and advising some real genuine personalities. Some, of course, like in all walks of life, are really much less interesting off the field or out of the ring than they are in it, I hasten to add. But I guess the two that stick out most, on the one hand, of course, is the legend that is Paolo Di Canio, and on the other, probably Chris Eubank, neither of whom need any introduction, and both of whom can talk forever and at a million miles without any encouragement, believe their own publicity, have their own very strong opinions, and always come down on the side of, you do what I want to do, but what I say is the right way. And once you get to that point and you grasp that particular nettle, then representation is relatively straightforward. The only difficulty with men of such strong character is having to dissuade them from their own argument and point out perhaps a different course than that which they originally would have preferred to embark upon in order to achieve the best result. Because they are such strong personalities and tough characters, but they are real highlights for both good and ill. It's great fun, but it can also drive you to distraction. But, you know, that's the nature of the beast, and I needn't say much more about it than that. Firstly, in order to try to represent very high-profile sportsmen, you have to understand that everyone wants to represent them. Because, of course, other than the work, it's a great buzz. And you must understand that you're one of a pack that's chasing that work. It's almost like ambulance chasing to some extent. And therefore, the best way to achieve your aim, in my view, is to do very little and not to chase at all, and hope that your representation or your reputation and the representation that you've given others will, in effect, buy you that particular goal. That word of mouth is the best form of assistance. Going out there and demanding will achieve nothing. You have to, as well, when you do get the chance to represent these people, make it quite clear that you do so on your terms and not theirs. Very often they expect you to do it on their terms, and very often they will regard it as an honour for you to represent them, and you should do it either for no money or for very little money. Well, we live in the real world, and I always take the view that a high-profile footballer doesn't step on the pitch unless he's being paid, a high-profile boxer won't step into the ring unless he's being paid, and nor should I, and nor should anybody else. But unfortunately, all too often, there are a number of lawyers so desperate to do the work that they might forget that and seek to provide their services for either no money or very little money in order to get the client. That's not good for them and it's not good for anyone, so I certainly wouldn't do that. But ultimately, you have to mix in the right circles. You have to know the right people, you have to go to the right events, you have to be seen at the right places at the right times, and when you do meet people, you have to behave in the right way. And by that, I mean trying to find that very, very delicate balance of being approachable, but remaining professional and one step away from them, and also being knowledgeable without showing off and making them think that you know much more about their particular problem and their particular sport than they do. So it's a very, very narrow line that you have to walk, but you learn through experience how to do it, and you learn through experience automatically what to say and how to behave. The most interesting sports case is always very tough, because cases naturally are more interesting for different reasons. I think one of the most demanding was a sports stroke criminal case in which I was involved about 3 or 4 years ago now, when I represented leading for one of the defendants charged with a fraud arising out of the takeover of Derby County Football Club. It was a perfect case for me. I come from a criminal defence background, and doing sports work, it was perfect. I didn't have to learn to grapple with the vagaries of football and the various mechanisms that operate, or the expectations. It was all a given, and of course my experience in the criminal courts made that part equally easy for me to take on board. But my client, who I say many times, I'm delighted to say, was the only one who was acquitted, which gave me great pleasure. It was a very serious case for him. Had he been convicted, he would have gone to prison. He was a man himself who loved football, but he was a businessman, and he was, like so many people are, attracted to the glamour of it all, that perhaps, in all honesty, he took his eye off the ball, no pun, and wasn't perhaps as rigorous in his own investigation as to what he was getting into than he otherwise would have been in the normal course of his business. And that's why he allowed himself to be swept up, and I think to be taken advantage of. Fortunately, the jury thought the same, but the case involved the mechanism by which the club was taken over, and payments that were made to those involved or not, and he was right in the middle of that. The case was a 4 or 5 month trial. It was huge pressure. It was very interesting because we had to really put a different slant on things. We had to expose the way in which football in the early part of the 2000s was operated at the highest end, and bring that out to a jury who were otherwise, I'm sure, as attracted to the glamour of it all and believed everything they read in the papers, which is very often in professional sport a far distance from what happens in normal sort of life. So that was a case that was very demanding and also interesting, because it cut across not just sporting issues, but cut across criminal issues with a much more severe penalty had it all gone wrong than in the normal sporting sense of the word. Other than that, I'm always loath to pick names of clients that I've represented in discipline and regulatory work, because a lot of these things do remain private, and of course the confidentiality is the client's, not mine, and I'm therefore very, very mindful of that. But what I think is particularly of interest to me is the vagaries in which particularly the Football Association and the British Boxing Board of Control work, insofar as there is a huge criticism from my point of view that they are effectively judge, jury and executioner. Now I know, of course, within the FA they set up an independent panel or tribunal ultimately, but when you're in the middle of it, you can feel the pressure being applied from the media and from the FA to achieve a given result. And if that's a result that's contrary to your client, it's a very tough push in the opposite direction. And the same applies with boxing, which I believe firmly really does need a complete overhaul in its organisation. I'm well aware that there are some very decent people that have worked tirelessly in support of British boxing, and particularly the Board of Control, but from a jurisdictional point of view, from a juridical point of view, some of the ways in which they operate leave a lot to be desired. They maintain no more than the status quo and allow the powerful, the promoters and managers, effectively to dictate terms, and I think that that needs to change. But unfortunately, sportsmen, like all of us, ultimately are pragmatists, and they will put up with or go along with that which may not be right and which may be capable of legal challenge, purely if they think in the short term they can achieve their particular desire, namely the right crack at a title or the best contract that's on the table. And as often in the law, a lot of wrong will pass under the bridge, and it won't be seized upon if, of course, from the point of view of the protagonist, it doesn't really matter and they're happy in any event. It's only when the wheels really do come off that there will be any change. And that's a frustrating element, I think, of many legal cases. To give an example, representing certain footballers who have been charged with minor public order offences, where my own view would have been and was that the decision to prosecute should have been challenged, because I think it was against the public interest. When a player has been fined hugely by his club, been suspended for a large number of games, a penalty or a sanction which is much greater than the criminal court could ever possibly hope to apply, and the decision has been made to prosecute, which in my view would amount to an abuse of process. But of course, to argue that, you're doing it in front of a magistrate's court, the wrong forum to argue it, it incurs more cost, and from the point of view of the player, if he pleads guilty to a minor offence, so what? He doesn't need, therefore, to spend a fortune on me and the solicitor behind me, and can avoid a lot of aggravation, and so he'll swallow it, but that doesn't mean that's right. If you want to make a career as a sports lawyer, first and foremost, you've got to be a great lawyer. You've got to continually work on it and hone your skills in all the widest sense of representation that you might expect for a sports person, whether it be in employment work, whether it be in discipline or regulatory, or whether it be in contractual advice. You've actually got to be a good contract lawyer. You've got to be a good regulatory or disciplinary advocate, or you've got to be a really good employment lawyer, first and foremost. You've got to understand those particular disciplines, because it's their application to sport in the widest sense that takes you where you want to go. It's not the other way around. Secondly, you've got to be patient. You've got to put yourself out there. You've got to mix with the right people. You've got to work on the basis that it won't come to you. You've got to go to it. You've got to forge good relationships within the law and outside it. Go to the right conferences, attend the right matches, get yourself invited to the right dinners, be it the Football Writers' Dinner, the PFA for football, boxing, likewise, get involved with the board. In some way or form, you need to be involved, you need to be recognised, and you need to put yourself about. For me, I'm very fortunate. I've been a legal analyst in sports matters for Sky Sports News, predominantly for about 10 years now, and that's great promotion and publicity for me. But find your own niche for that. And lastly, love what you're doing, because if you don't, you're never going to achieve it. You've really got to want it and to love it. It's not easy. There are so many people that want to do it, and if you're going to put yourself out there to do it and do what's got to be done, you've really got to love it. When you stop loving it, then you're never going to make it.